Everybody, welcome to Merton Council's Design Review panel. This afternoon we're considering two important matters, the Borough Character Study and the Small Sites Toolkit. To start us going, I'll invite Tara Butler, one of Merton's council officers, to set the scene. Tara, over to you, please.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, panel, and thank you for inviting us here today. We've got two planning guidance documents, one called the Borough Character Study and one called the Small Sites Toolkit. And these documents are both in their own way designed to try and elevate the status of design and the quality of design for the applications we receive and that are determined in Merton. Most of Merton, in fact 90% of applications received for new homes are on small sites. So master plans have their place, but we also need to make sure that there's documents that cover the whole of the borough. These two documents have been out to public consultation recently, and yesterday was the final day of public consultation, and we have a wealth of information from residents and community groups and other members of the public on them. But we'd really like your views here today as practitioners as to how usable these documents are. It's really important that both the Borough Character Study and the Small Sites Toolkit are going to be used by professionals in the built environment, and that's really where we value your feedback. The Borough Character Study is going to be presented by our consultant, Eliza Morrison, and the Small Sites Toolkit is going to be presented by colleagues Mark and Abre. I'd like to invite Eliza Morrison to start their presentation on the Borough Character Study, if that's all right with you, Chair.
Yes, please start, Eliza.
Lovely. Okay, I was just going to share some slides, but I think I need the screen share enabled, if that's possible.
Oh, apologies.
No worries.
That should be set up now.
Brilliant. Okay, can everybody see a nice blue map? Good. Okay, so we're just going to start off, quick 10-minute presentation. Obviously, it's a long document. I'm Alice Strang. I'm an associate at Eliza Morrison, and we've been working with Merton Council over the last 6 months to a year on this study. So I'm sure you'll all be familiar with Eliza Morrison, but we have both a planning team, urban design team, as well as the kind of wider architectural office as well. The architectural side of the firm have been involved in a number of architectural projects in the area, including the King's College School and the AILTech Master Plan as well. In terms of the experience of our team, we are working regularly across London on characterization studies. At the moment, alongside Merton, we've been working a lot in West London, so also have recently started work for Ealing, Harrow and Hounslow. So that's been really useful in terms of being able to sort of compare similar outer London contexts. I should also mention actually Solid Space are part of our team. And so the idea was that they are experts particularly in looking at smaller sites, but also thinking about the development and delivery context as well. So just in terms of a starting point, sort of setting the scene really in terms of characterization, as a team, we always sort of start with the idea that character is definitely more than just buildings and spaces. It's about that interplay between social, historical and the physical factor, and we try and kind of draw that out within our documents. And on a kind of diagrammatic level, this Venn diagram sort of illustrates that overlap, really, the kind of physical characteristics that we look at in terms of things such as the blue and green network, topography, land use, some of that kind of overlap with the history and current society in terms of socioeconomics, town centres, thinking even about sort of house prices and how that affects current day character. And then thinking forward to existing development that's coming forward in terms of scale massing, fronts and backs, material palette, and kind of how all that overlaps within the middle is sort of how we want to think about future growth in the borough. And so, you know, something we're often asked by the community is sort of, what is the point of characterization? You know, what are we aiming at here really? And it's very much about sort of trying to deliver the idea of sort of context-led intensification, where we're thinking in a much more detailed way about the relationships between buildings, streets, and neighbourhoods. In terms of the document, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is made up of sort of 4 key parts really. Firstly, the introduction, which we wanted to make really clear. And so the introduction answers a series of questions. Why do we need the study? What will the document be used for? How was this document made? Thinking about the data that was used that fed into it. What is character and why is it important? And then what did you tell us? And I'll come back to that in a moment. In terms of the other chapters, which we'll talk through as well, part B is very much about the borough's existing character. And so we kind of set out the sort of README to understand the borough's existing character. Part C to I are about the distinctive neighbourhoods and borough areas, so breaking Merton down into sort of sub areas. And then part J is about thinking about the evolution of character and thinking about what future growth should be like within each context. So something we should mention, community engagement, really sort of impressive. The council really wanted the character study to be a kind of heavily engaged process with sort of lots of community activities to sort of draw through all of that information within the report. Obviously, with the sort of COVID-19 hit shortly after the study was commissioned, and so that meant that we had to sort of really quickly replan all the events that we'd proposed. But we were able to go ahead with quite a few digital events. We've had over 450 people contribute through the engagement process, which has been done through a series of online public surveys and also sort of stakeholder workshops, which have been really valuable about talking about some of the detail. There's elements within the document where we've been able to map all of the comments that we've received geographically using our GIS analysis, and that enables us to see, for example, the little red points on this map show where people are, particularly when we were looking at the boundaries of the neighbourhoods, where people were unhappy with the way something was drawn. So it's a really quick way of suddenly being able to visualise where there might be areas we need to discuss in more detail. We always start in terms of characterization with the evolution of the place, particularly when we're thinking about planning the next phase of growth. We need to understand where we've come from. So these are just example spreads from the report really that draw out Merton's evolution. We want to understand how the borough has evolved. That gives us a better understanding of the current day. So thinking about the street pattern, building types, uses in town centres, and then also drawing out interesting social history, which is often something that comes out during consultation. So we better understand the sort of identity and psyche of places, because that is absolutely part of their character. And we want to make sure that the past helps to shape the future. And also that story really also acknowledges that character is a shifting thing, which again is a kind of really useful message in terms of discussions with the local community. And obviously they're just examples of some of the maps, but this shows all of Merton's historic assets in terms of conservation areas and listed buildings. And that process of evolution leaves us with these amazing assets. In terms of other examples of mapping, we use really sort of part B of the report. We've used GIS to think about how we can layer different elements of data to draw out particular trends and characteristics, to understand which parts of the borough are, for example, well connected, which parts of the borough are more or less deprived. Thinking about the physical character in terms of topography has a huge impact on things like views, and also thinking about the grain of each place. And that takes us nicely to, again, one of the elements that we always think about quite hard is the sort of typology classification of the area. And these are the typology trees that we develop, which enable us to sort of break down the borough, first of all, by kind of land use classification, understanding whether the area we're looking at is residential or non-residential, then thinking about the block or the street structure. So is it a perimeter form or a free form? And then thinking about some of those sort of subtypes within those categories. So is it a suburban form of housing, or is it a kind of cul-de-sac form? And that produces these maps, and they're a kind of really important part of the output that allow you to see sort of quite strategic issues. So in Merton, you've got this kind of quite a distinct sort of urban wedge that follows the railway line and the much lower density sort of suburban character of the hill. And sort of, maps like this allow us to really quickly see some of those trends and characteristics. Moving forward then to part C of the report, this is very much about kind of zooming into the character of individual neighbourhoods, and these areas were developed through some of that extensive consultation. So we used digital survey tools to allow people to pinpoint and draw the boundaries of their neighbourhoods. And so this is really about thinking, the idea of these is that they're sort of places that summarise the special and defining qualities, but at a neighbourhood scale. And these are really important in terms of the local community's understanding of place. And we'll go through some of those in a little bit more detail later on. What we've also done is to then plot each of those neighbourhoods on this spectrum in terms of understanding their potential for change. So each neighbourhood is plotted on our spectrum from very little change. So some of these neighbourhoods, it's going to be about repairing the existing character, to at the other end of the spectrum where we're talking about perhaps more comprehensive change in some neighbourhoods and reimagining the existing character in some small areas. So I won't go through each of the borough areas, but just taking one as an example. So Collier's Wood, each part of those areas starts off with an introduction to the overall borough area, introducing the sort of evolution and how we came to be, also linking back to the typologies and some of the information that we got through from the local community. Each chapter also then has an analysis of distinctive factors of that neighbourhood and perhaps drawing out some key issues and opportunities. And then for each sub area, there are also a set of growth themes where we're able to be a bit more propositional about the type of growth that could come forward in that area. So here we might be talking about more detailed recommendations, such as thinking about future design guidance for Victorian terrace streets, but also some strategic recommendations for the future of the area, such as perhaps a master plan for the Collier's Wood area. And this sets out some high level principles for the sorts of things that master plan should be looking at. And then the final part of the report, and this is the part of the report that perhaps links most closely to the small sites work. So we've looked at each typology in turn, and then again, I've just pulled out a couple of examples here. So we've looked at some residential typologies, and here we're sort of drawing out both so the location of where these typologies are located in Merton, and we've developed these sort of axonometric diagrams that shows a kind of typical condition of the typology before, and then at a very high level, pointing to potential opportunities for character-led intensification of that typology. Again, pulling out precedents. So both examples from within Merton and sort of other outer London contexts of good examples of where that typology has been intensified. And this is on the right-hand side of this page, the work of Solid Space, looking then at specific sites within Merton and how looking at a specific example, how that development might come forward within that typology. We've also looked at mixed use typologies, so development within obviously town centres, industrial areas, and also along parades. So obviously the sort of parades and corridors within Merton are quite an important growth opportunity. And so we've sort of thought quite hard about what might be appropriate within these areas in terms of their intensification. And again, pointing to precedents both within the borough and elsewhere. The report draws to a conclusion really with a series of high-level principles, drawing out the sort of type of intensification and thinking about how that works from a characterization perspective. So thinking about an emphasis on supporting and reinforcing the role of town centres, perhaps thinking in Morden and Collier's Wood about the opportunity for more transformational growth, thinking about opportunities for restoring historic routes, as we've talked about in terms of the corridors within the borough, thinking about opportunities to celebrate green infrastructure and revitalising waterways, and also the role of local parades within Outer London and how they can become really important hubs of local activity. And then other core principles about within, again, the sort of more suburban context about opportunities to sort of overcome the barriers created by rail and road infrastructure in some places, and again, managing the transition between areas of different land use in a suburban context. And so finally, just to touch then on next steps, as Tara mentioned, we've sort of just drawn to the end of that sort of 6-week consultation period, and the document is intended to be adopted as an SPD, supplementary planning document. I think one of the really exciting things that Merton have decided to do and that we're helping them with is to develop a story map, which is effectively a website, which will allow the characterization study to be sort of much more interactively used and much more accessible in terms of the sort of information. There are these dashboards that all the GIS data will be allowed to much more easily be explored within. So that's something that we're hoping that is live quite soon. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alice, for what is for this introduction and summary for what is clearly a very comprehensive study. I think the next stage in our process is for me to invite panel members to ask any questions of clarification that they may wish to put to Alice or indeed to Tara. Panel members, are there any such questions?
I had a query regarding the sort of extensions of neighbourhoods part of the document. I don't know whether this is a question for Alice or local authority, but how is that part of the document expected to be used moving forward? Because some of the areas only had 3 people responding, so I'm wondering whether those boundaries are looking to be moved, or whether they're just a sort of a thought on how those could change in the future.
So I can take that if you like.
Yeah, happily. I can chip in afterwards if you like.
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned before, we have a wealth of responses that we're just going through following the consultation finishing yesterday, and I think it's fair to say that we're going to consider those carefully. I'm not sure at the moment whether we'll definitely move boundaries if someone has suggested them, but often people who live or work in the area have a really thorough understanding of why they believe something could be moved or be different. So all I can say at the moment is we'll look at those responses carefully. I'd also say that often it isn't the number of responses, but it's actually what they say in the content that comes out really strongly. We've just done some public consultation on the local plan, and you do find responses. Maybe only one person making that response, but they point out something that everyone's missed so far, and that can really improve the document.
Okay, thanks.
Bea, did you wish to ask a question?
Yeah, I think my question is very similar to Michael's actually. It was in the areas where potentially you may only have had a few comments. Was there any ambition to maybe delve a bit more? Because it is something that is going to form, and it's brilliant that it will form development going forward. And sometimes people aren't aware, so it might be, or was everyone in the localities where you've had less response made aware? Do you think there was enough time for them to acknowledge it, read it, understand? Because it is quite technical, and respond.
Alice, I can take this again if you like. Yes, I mean, it is, we recognise that it can be a struggle, especially when we're operating on an entirely online platform, for people in a period of 6 weeks to be able to absorb the information that they're seeing and then formulate a response. And we're hugely appreciative of those who take the time. It's worth mentioning, as Alice said, that there was some consultation done last year as well. So the document that you see isn't just the result of the sort of 6 weeks we've done recently. And the other thing we're doing is also speaking to yourselves as practitioners, and on the Small Sites Toolkit, we've also spoken to other practitioners just to make sure that we have a balance of when people live and work in the area, of what they're able to say about it, but also that the document ends up something that's actually used. Because I suppose our worry with many of these things is that we do a piece of work and then it isn't used enough. And that's really sort of why we're trying to encourage responses from practitioners as well as from members of the public.
Yeah, and although, you know, absolutely a couple of the areas we didn't have through the survey, a huge number of responses. There were some areas that we got hundreds, and we also had a workshop with, I think it was between 30 and 40 members of the local community, where we kind of reviewed effectively the kind of draft map, and again kind of did a sort of second pass at kind of scribbling and creating the areas. So there has been a sort of fair amount of wiggling around with the lines. But I think one of the points we would always make is that the actual line, the road that is drawn down, is important, but it's not after all the sort of overall process or the sort of final point. It's really much more sort of about thinking at roughly the correct scale, and I think that's sort of the thing to kind of take away.
Thank you. Deepa, do you have a question? You have to unmute.
Apologies. It was a couple of things actually. So just leading on from your the consultation, I don't know if you studied sort of the whether many of the responses were received by a particular demographic or group in you know, within the areas, and whether there's been an attempt to reach out to some of the perhaps more diverse groups that perhaps wouldn't normally be responding to consultations. I mean, I know as an architect that, you know, there are certain people that have the time and are sort of minded to do those kind of responses, and it doesn't really capture everyone in society, including, you know, some of the very young and the very old. And then the second question is about sustainability, and just have you thought at all about the sort of zero carbon target, and how perhaps new developments might be able to take certain guidance on board from the start in order to address those concerns going forward?
Alice, would you like to mention about the Built ID survey? Because we did do some work, or sometimes our issues are that we don't get many young people responding. And when I say young, I mean anyone under 45 really responding. So we did take a slightly different tack, especially last year, to try and generate initial responses.
Yeah, so there were two separate surveys, weren't there? There was the sort of Built ID survey, and then there was a second survey that was for the characterization itself. But I think both of those, the demographics were much younger than perhaps some of those kind of non-digital tools pick up, which is kind of really encouraging. But yeah, absolutely. I think COVID has been a really, really challenging context in terms of sort of making sure and sort of being able to reach some of those harder to reach audiences. You know, we'd often do things like sort of pop-ups in town centres, but I think some of those digital surveys are kind of really useful tools in picking up some of those younger audiences. In terms of sustainability, yep, I think it's certainly something that we could sort of reflect on to sort of do a review of the document with sort of that lens on. Obviously there's both a sort of slightly more detailed design guidance which Mark's going to speak about in terms of the small sites kit, but as you say, it's kind of a really important element to be thinking about sort of from first principles. So it's a good point.
Okay, are there any other questions before we move on to the next stage in our process? I think not.
I did have one other.
Michael?
I wasn't sure whether it's for now or for later, but obviously within this study, which I think is brilliant and it's far-reaching and it's got a lot of information in it, but when it comes to areas like Alice brought up, Colliers Wood, where I used to live. When we're talking about the reimagining or the sort of trying to sort it out better, you know, the three areas they were looking at on that were Sainsbury's, Priory Retail Park, and Tandem Centre. How can, it's something that's come up in DRPs before, but how can we, you know, that's a big landowner there, Sainsbury's, or you know, how can we bring those projects forward? I guess it's going to be a council-led initiative, but in terms of developing master plans for those kind of big sites, but also getting a buy-in from Sainsbury's that we can redevelop it, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it's certainly one of the areas within the borough that needs thinking about in a holistic way, and that is one of the kind of growth-themed recommendations, if you like, sort of within the Colliers Wood chapter, is that there should be a kind of a council-led sort of master plan or development brief, so sort of a strategic plan for that area. So, you know, from our point of view, that message is quite strong within the document, and sort of, although it is an area that's talked about as sort of reimagined, you know, it also talks about some of the existing character within the area that needs to be better celebrated, thinking about how the river could sort of be sort of much better sort of revealed, and also thinking about sort of Merton Abbey Mills and the kind of status of that, sort of how it's accessed, and thinking about the sort of context of the development that would come forward around that. So it is a kind of message that's strong within the characterization, but yeah, I don't know if Tara wants to comment in terms of future plans.
It's more of a question of how is the local authority actually going to make sure that these kind of big the plans that you've quite eloquently put out in the document are actually followed through with, and it doesn't just stay there for another 20 years, and that site is just, nothing happens to it and nothing improves apart from those little, the toolkit kind of responses.
Or on the flip side, that it doesn't, you know, developers don't approach it with, you know, over ambitious and disrespectful ideas.
There's several ways as a council that we try and encourage this kind of change, and I think Colliers Wood is a good example of that. One is by sending a clear message that the council is supportive of the development of retail sheds where they're not needed, and where they're hampering the area, and especially for mixed use development. And we look at that through the local plan. So, for example, on the Priory Retail Park, that's proposed for allocation in the council's local plan. And we're in dialogue with the landowner to see what their ambitions are, and ideally work with them on a master plan for the site. And it's the same with the other major landowners in the area, including Sainsbury's, understanding what their ambition is for the site. And I think it's fair to say for the large Sainsbury's site, that's been very successful for them as a Sainsbury's for many years. But they do keep in touch with us on those issues, and we certainly send a clear message through our planning policies that we'd be willing to see change there. In Colliers Wood, as well as having some positives, there are also some sort of barriers to development that partly includes the flood risk from the river, which is why Sainsbury's is on stilts in the first place. But it also includes the pylons that run across Priory Retail Park and some other sites that hamper the scope for development. So again, it's about working with the landowners and being in touch with the national grid as to whether there's any scope for changing that aspect, and also being in touch with the Environment Agency to try and de-risk certain developments and make sure that really what's proposed is appropriate for the area and not, you know, something that would detract from it.
Thanks, Tara. That was really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's time now to move on to the individual comments phase. Before we do that, can I ask one of the panel members to volunteer to sum up at the end of the discussion? I have a volunteer to sum up. Marcus. Thank you very much. Okay. I'll leave you to the end then when it comes to speaking. Who would like to kick off the comment stage? Shall I choose someone at random? I will. Isabel, Bella Percy, would you like to start off?
Sure. Hello.
Thank you very much. Hello.
I enjoyed reading the giant document very much. Weighty tome, isn't it? I suppose my overall kind of impression of it was that it seemed, I don't know if any of the other panel members found this, that it's much more focused on being a sort of urban design based study rather than an architectural one. And so I wonder, in some cases where we're talking a lot about character, there seems certain aspects of character of local areas which didn't necessarily feel like they got picked out hugely. I understand that there's kind of a page limit perhaps in terms of what people can withstand, but I suppose certain things about the characters, the history of each area, heights, forms, materials felt like they didn't really so much get picked up. And so I thought there was one really great public consultation comment quite early in the document where someone is worrying about the character of different areas of the borough being a bit diluted. And I thought actually that was something which I maybe felt when I read through the kind of areas where it talks about growth themes, in that quite frequently the same idea for growth themes is picked up in each area. And so perhaps, you know, how much variation is there between these areas and how much is it reflecting the different characters of certain areas? So that maybe I felt maybe something was a little bit missing there. I thought I enjoyed the kind of that you had a definition of mid-rise buildings as well as high-rise buildings, which I thought was great in the context of a borough that isn't particularly high-rise. But I felt like perhaps the definition of where might be appropriate for those different heights felt quite vague. So I mean, perhaps it's intentionally vague, but it's, you know, the maps kind of relating to that didn't feel super readable to me. And so because we're losing kind of the quantitative sort of ideas of the density matrix in the London plan, I felt that maybe we could be stronger in something that like replaces that in Merton, or that is particular about that in Merton, perhaps. Where we had the growth, I thought were really interesting, but I thought it might even be interesting, I don't know, I mean, this is sort of adding lots of detail to pick out particular case studies. So where we have the later on these ideas about the particular areas in their studies produced by Solid Space, I thought those were great. The one area that it felt like there wasn't really any kind of case study on were the kind of green character areas. So in the growth themes areas, there's lots of discussion about greening streets, introducing more shade, water infrastructure, but there isn't really a case study or anything specific on those more public realm aspects in the borough. And I suppose because in a way those are things which maybe not all the time, or like me as an architect rather than a landscape architect, I'm maybe not getting involved in because they're part of public realm, they're part of council land. But I think it'd be really interesting to try and highlight those a bit more. And similarly, discussion of working with existing buildings. There's kind of, it's sort of, there's little bits of it here and there about saying that we're going to have information on how we improve environmental performance of existing buildings, but perhaps being able to be more specific about the different types of buildings that applies to and where we go for guidance in that. Because actually that's kind of a huge part of what's happening in the borough is repair, but there isn't so much about repair, there's a lot about new buildings. So those were the kind of bits I felt maybe sort of fell between the cracks a little bit. And then I guess maybe this is more a question that I should have asked in the question section, but how those kind of wider scale public realm type ideas and projects are enacted, like how do we get those to happen? Because they're not things that happen on individual sort of small sites, they're things that have to happen with the local authority. And it'd be great to find a way of making sure that those happen. And I don't know if that's something that happens in the document or something that is a wider theme for the local authority to deal with. So I think those are most of my things. I had some boring graphical technical things, but maybe I'll let everyone else make comments and leave those unless we get bored at the end. So that was me.
Thank you very much. Claire May, could I ask you to give your comments next, please?
Hi there, yeah. Overall, I thought it was a really kind of comprehensive document. I mean, it's quite, at first it feels quite a long document, but then it's more likely that I suppose it'll be used to review sub-character areas by applicants and teams. So actually when you dig in, they actually have a very kind of small portion of the document for each sub area, and I suppose it's getting the balance right between the whole length of the document and giving enough detail in those small character areas, because you're probably going to dip in as a designer and just look at one small area, and you might only have sort of 6 or 7 bullet points. So it's for me, I don't know how you kind of reconcile the length of the document with detail that you're trying to bring out. But I did find it was a really well illustrated, and there's lots of photos in there which always really helpful to kind of bring out those ideas. I must admit, architectural features, I also agree with Isabella that those kind of features were missing, and it was more kind of either street themes or building types. So even if it could just be some kind of small images on some of the features of buildings would really help, I think. Same goes for green spaces and those features, and bring those out. I also picked up on retrofit and the need to retrofit in the borough probably over the next 20 years or so, even 10. And guidance on retrofit, it comes down to whether you've got heritage or appearance constrained areas and buildings. And I think even a kind of a page acknowledging that, or half a page acknowledging that in the document, would be really helpful, because I think if people are coming to retrofit, it would be a shame to cover up a lot of these buildings shown in the document that might be outside of conservation areas, or but there is a real issue in us needing to retrofit, but working out where to do it appropriately. So I think a little nod to that, because it could change the character, even though they've been given the character and it's all set out in the document for them, and that's really helpful. If they come along and then change that through retrofit, it would be a bit of a shame in some areas. So I think finding a way to kind of look at that would be really helpful. But I mean, overall for me, I found it a really informative and helpful document. So I think it's great. Yeah, great work. And I could see a lot of work's gone into it.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Deepa Joshi, could I ask for your comments, please?
Hi. So I think obviously leading on from the comments made about retrofit is the sustainability angle, and I think, you know, just addressing perhaps guides on sort of orientation and you know, how that might be an element that can be approached from first principles it would be an interesting addition to the document. I also felt that some areas perhaps could be given a little bit more emphasis. So for instance, you know, Wimbledon Town perhaps needed a little bit more coverage. I know there's an SPD that you know, for the development of that, but that perhaps picking up on some of it's obviously a more significant area than some of the others, and it felt as if it was a little bit brushed over in terms of character. And obviously there's going to be a lot of plans coming forward for that particular area. Yeah, generally, I mean, it is great to see areas focused on for their sort of character and identity, but and this is a tricky one. It would be nice to see a little bit more on the sort of social value of an area, and how perhaps how certain areas might have points of character that people are drawn to, and particularly in the sort of post-COVID era, you know, where are the sort of outdoor spaces, or, you know, the public realm areas that are that need to be enhanced or supported or you know, enlivened, so that people can, you know, are drawn to them, and perhaps where you know, it's indicated that there might be more requirement on on improving the dynamic or the offer of an area in terms of other than residential, that perhaps some sort of guidance on what that might be to enhance the area, to appeal more to the residents of that particular area. I think it is it's quite specific and local for each different part of Merton, because it's so diverse. So it's different communities. Yeah, I think that's my main points.
Thank you, Deepa. Can I ask Bea Young to give her comments, please, Bea?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks so much for the presentation. It was it really helped coalesce everything in my mind. And again, I agree the document is exceptional. I can see how much hard work's gone into it, but it was quite long. So I'll try and pick up on the notes that I think quite a lot of my thoughts have already been mentioned. The one thing that I had down as my key point, which I think Deepa's just picked up on, is it is a very sort of educated, I suppose, document, because it is appealing to you know, professionals to come and have a look at. But the one thing I felt potentially could really now be, especially after COVID, that could be maybe analysed more is sort of the demographic. Is that is the people within the areas. It felt that, I think Deepa said social value. It did feel that there's each of the small boroughs, but very much has a population that's associated with the small areas, the character areas that you've got. So Collier's Wood and say Morden is different to Wimbledon Park and the Village. And then when you go further down, you know, into Mitcham and areas, each of those have quite specific characters that are just as affected by the people who live there as the architecture that is emerging and existing there. And I felt that was the one thing that wasn't really picked up upon. It did feel that there were quite a lot of areas where the same answer was just put across each one. And I thought that was potentially because of COVID and not being able to go and talk to all the people, which goes back to my question at the beginning about whether you actually really got to understand the areas from talking to enough people in all those areas. And I wondered particularly if that was slightly more relevant in the areas that you've highlighted as maybe having slightly more deprivation than others. I thought the transition between the different character areas potentially wasn't explored as much as it could be. So they're very, I think someone else has already said, each area has its own clear identity, but actually between those, and I think even Alice, you mentioned it, where does the line stop? Because actually if you've got a line going down the middle of the street, how do the two sides correspond, and how does that transition get explored, you know, so it benefits both. And then I also thought, sorry, let me just check, I've got all my notes. Yeah, so the boundary edges, the character and dominance, the demographic. Oh yeah, and then the last thing was, again, linking, I wondered whether you've got, so the document's really long, and I wondered if there was sort of like an overview document that someone could just grab that would be shorter, but meant that you wouldn't need to go through the whole document, and whether that overview would then pick up on some of the key Merton characters that sort of make Merton as a whole the great place it is to live and work. And I wondered whether some of those would pick up, particularly, I think, as others have just said, on the green spaces. So for instance, where do the teenagers go? Where's the place they go and play football? Where are those areas? How does that affect the character of the area next to it? Do they have to travel from one area to another to do that? If they are doing that, is there a safe, well lit right use to do it? Does that need more greening? Does that need more security? Does that need more street lighting? What are all those other things that link together these small areas so that the identity for each neighbourhood is clear, but the route between them is also quite strong in terms of wayfinding? And I think that potentially was the bit that wasn't drawn out as much as it could be. And maybe that could be done in an overarching document that sat along the top, and then you could dive into the bit that you needed to go and look at your particular area that you'd be designing and developing. That was it.
Thank you, Bea. Michael Whitwell, would you like to give your comments, please?
Yeah, I'll try and pick up something that other people haven't already mentioned. As B said, it's a great report. I mean, you know, in terms of as a architect picking it up, and it goes for the toolkit as well. And if you didn't live there, I mean, the great thing for us is that we live there, or have lived there, or live near it, so we kind of understand the issues. But if you were coming at this completely blind, then it gives you a really good, you know, all the information, all the maps and everything, give a really good basis for how you might deal with whatever area it is that you're looking to develop. One of the things that I've picked up, and it's quite personal to me and my family, because my wife drives from Motswell Park to Tooting every day along the A24, and it's picked up in a few of the character area studies about the fact that either side of the road is disconnected. You know, I think in the South Wimbledon part, it says about it used to be a thriving high street, now it's been diminished by the road. I wondered whether there was any way that could be brought into the document in terms of how that could be improved, or whether that's a wider strategy that the council are looking at for it. I think someone in the Rains Park comments said about, could the one-way system be pedestrianised and or removed and make it into a one route rather than sort of a ring road around the centre. So maybe that's not a point. Maybe that's a question for Tina or the guys from the council on whether that's something that actually, another element of this report that's brought up that is being thought about or developed in any way. But I mean, otherwise, I mean, the guys have picked up most of the questions in quite a good position in a way. But I thought it was a great report, and I think it will help people develop their ideas for where, you know, if they don't know Merton, then I think it will help. But I think the points on the character, the architectural elements of character, materials and stuff is missing, and that would be helpful as well if you were looking to, if you didn't know the area, then well, what is the prevailing materiality or building type in that area. I know you've gone for the building types in terms of the street patterns and stuff like that, but you know, how do they differ?
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Marcus, over to you to provide a summary of the various comments we've heard, please, plus comments of your own too, of course.
Well, if I may, Chair, I'll start with my own comments and then summarise. And please, when I get to summarising, correct me if I miss anything out. My first point, number one, I think it's about right, this report. I think there is a balance to be struck between how much detail you put in and how expansive it becomes, and how much this report is like a framework that then points you towards other bits of information. So my first instinct as a practitioner is, yes, that's good. On the DRP, we've often said to people, you know, go out and understand what the place is before you start telling us how you're going to change it. And this is really what this report is aiming to do, is to get people thinking about what is it that I'm about to change. And my perspective as a conservation practitioner is that what you're doing is kind of what we've always done, which is to try and understand and demonstrate an understanding of place and sense of place. And I was pleased to hear your points earlier on in your commentary, but also in the report, about understanding how we've got to where we are now, the trajectory that has got us here, in order that we can better predict the future. So I think its heart is absolutely in the right place, and I think the balance is about right, and it is completely correct to help focus developers and applicants onto this notion of character. I think it's great that it's community-led. I think it's great that you're listening to people, because I know architects and engineers think that towns are made of bricks and concrete, but actually towns are made of much softer things than that. and things that have people that have opinions and so on and so forth. So that's all good. There's a balance to be struck in all planning guidance and planning policy between allowing and controlling. At its worst, something like this could become a sort of style guide that forces people into certain solutions. And at its best, it's raising the principles that people should be thinking about in order that they can come up with their own creative solutions. So on the whole, I think that's good. Certain things I quibble with. I mean, I don't like the phrase "in keeping." I think if everybody built everything in keeping with everything else, we'd still be living in circular you know, willow huts with a hole in the middle to let the smoke out from our fire. So I prefer language that uses things like respecting character and responding to character rather than in keeping. But these are small points. I think it's, in terms of how you analyze the different areas and where the edges are, for me, if you have a strong center, you can afford to have a fuzzy edge. And I think that if we look at the map of Merton, there are certain kind of places that you can say have quite a strong character. And I think inevitably there will be places that transition between the two. So for me, I'm less concerned about the edges. I'm much more concerned about characterizing those centers. I think this will be a very useful document, not only in the short term, but I think in the long term. I can imagine, we do a lot of work on historic buildings. You know, if we were here in 50 years' time doing a project in Collier's Wood, this would be a fantastic document, historical document to look at, to say this is what they were thinking, this is what they wanted 50 years ago, and now let's see what they actually got. And I think the examples that you've chosen will also very much date this document to the 2020s. If you look at the pictures in it, you'll be able to say, ah, fine, you know, I can tell when this was made. And that is perfectly okay. You know, you're not trying to produce something that will stand the test of time forever. This is a snapshot of what we want now, so that's all good. I agree with my colleagues about the sustainability lens and the importance of really seeing everything through that filter, because I think in 20 years' time, when we're saying, oh, great, we've achieved our zero carbon Britain, haven't we? Ha ha, or have we? We will be looking back to see how that was achieved or not by these SDGs. So I think that's really important to do that. So, and I think it's great the way that it refers you through to other things like the conservation area character guides. So all good. There are a few tiny little typos and things which I think I'll send some comments by email offline. And just picking on Collier's Wood for the moment, you know, it really is the most incredible conundrum how you deal with Collier's Wood. And the biggest problem with it really is that bit of Merton Way that goes right across the scheduled ancient monument. You know, I can't think of another example where someone has actually built a road right through the middle of a scheduled ancient monument. It's absolutely shocking. And there seems to be a kind of tacit assumption that that move, that bit of elevated dual carriageway will have to stay forever. And I'd love to think that it doesn't have to stay forever. And it would completely unlock the character of Collier's Wood if you were able to read the Priory precinct as a precinct rather than as a kind of something that's just been crossed out by a major road. So those are my comments, but overall I think it's fantastic. To summarize colleagues' comments, there's a concern about how much architectural detail is brought in versus urban design. Personally, I think the focus should be on urban design, but there were comments that there should be more about architectural features and materials. We liked the idea of mid-rise building, and that perhaps could be developed a little bit further. There was we think there could be perhaps more emphasis on green spaces, green character areas, greening, and perhaps including a case study more focused on those non-built elements, public realm elements. Sustainability we talked about already, but particularly retrofit and the challenge of how we retrofit, and pointing out that there may be heritage constraints to overcladding everything with stow render. Again, a bit more on sustainability. Perhaps there could be more coverage on Wimbledon Town. And then issues about transitions between the areas. And then a point about the demographics and the people and the different social makeup of the areas and how that may have fed through into the level of consultation and whether that could be brought about a bit more. And then there was a request to, there was some issues about roads and whether roads could be rethought, whether we could reclaim the streets. And then there was a question of the overview, whether there's a sort of mini executive summary that you could add to the beginning of the document. And also whether there's something you could say about Merton Borough as a whole, maybe comparing it with other London boroughs. So hopefully that summarised everybody's points. Do tell me if I've missed anything out.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcus. I think that seemed a very full summary to me, covering everything. Paul McGarry, is there anything you would like to say at this stage?
No, thank you, Chair. I'm just running the Zoom today. I'm not participating in the review itself.
Okay, fine. Well, I think this brings this agenda item to a close, in actual fact. So thank you all for your comments. I think we will now move on to the second agenda item, which is the Small Sites Toolkit.
Stephen, before you do that, I think maybe we just need to check if anybody needs a comfort break or anything like that.
Okay,
is that suitable?
Shall we have
Sorry, Paul, I was going to say thank you very much for all your comments. I can't stay for part two, but that was really, really great to hear. So it's so nice to sort of absorb and appreciate people who have sort of properly read it all. So thank you very much and nice to meet you all.
Thank you very
much.
Alice.
Thanks, Alice.
Alice. Thank you.
Thanks for a great presentation.
Would people like a 5-minute comfort break? I'll take that as a yes then. So let us meet back at 3:05. That's okay. Welcome back to the design review panel. We're joined by an additional member of the panel, Jane Junker, for the second item on this afternoon's agenda, which is the Small Sites Toolkit. I believe we'll start with a presentation. Is that presentation by you, Mark Warner?
Yes, it is, yeah. I'll just share my screen now. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. It's not maximized at the moment for me, but I can see
it should be. Okay, I'll crack on then. It should be maxed for everyone else, right? It might be your internet connection. Okay, perfect. Okay, cool.
Yeah, don't worry.
All right, so hello everybody. I'm Mark Warren. I'm an urban designer from Future Merton. Just before we start, I'm presenting from my Mitcham bedroom with a very noisy 2-year-old in the background. So apologies if you hear any noises in the background. I'm hoping he doesn't come flying through. So just in terms of context and the process of the Small Sites Toolkit, We have got some GLA funding from the Home Building Capacity Fund, which actually funded both this project, the character study, as well as a previous study, which was an evidence-based study about housing delivery. We use that fund to get 2 public practice associates, which is myself and Abri, who's also on the call, to join the Future Merton team to assist on the production of the Small Sites Toolkit. Alongside all of this, we did a series of engagement internally with development control to really figure out how they would use a small sites design toolkit, how does it slot into the planning process, how they can use it within their pre-application meetings, and how they can use it to appraise applications after they've been in planning. We've also done a series of engagement externally with local authorities. So as you may know, Croydon have delivered their suburban design guide, I think maybe a year or 2 years ago. So we spoke to those guys to really understand any lessons learned, how we can learn from what they've developed. We've also spoken to other local authorities who are currently developing small sites guidance, spoken to a series of developers and architects and urbanists to really understand how we can kind of pitch this document right. That all was wrapped up into a draft toolkit, which you have all seen, and has gone through a 6-week public consultation. During that consultation, we've had 2 neighbourhood forums, we've had an email database, which has been over 700 emails out, online survey, workshops with developers and architects, and now we are at the DRP. All of that will then get wrapped up, hopefully, all the constructive criticism, and we'll make it into the adopted SPD soon come in the future. So why small sites and why is this toolkit needed? So small sites have largely contributed to Merton's housing delivery. As Tara mentioned at the very beginning, over 90% of applications in Merton are for small sites. As I was saying, with the housing delivery research, which was also commissioned with HCF funding, they asked residents I think we had over 2,000 responses from residents with this online engagement. But over 60% of residents suggested that they think new homes should be built on underused small sites. So obviously there is an appetite for that from the public. And over 60% of new homes in the borough within the last 15 years have been built on small sites. So it's safe to say that I think we are continuously going to be developing on small sites. It's just about how can we make sure the quality is up there and it doesn't slip. In Merton, Mark, as you all may know,
Mark, can I just interrupt?
Oh, yeah.
Could you put your
slides
on full screen? Just because I don't think it's changing for us.
Okay, sorry. Let me try again. Thanks, Abri. It's full screen on mine. Maybe that, can you see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Oh, yeah.
Is that all good? Okay, cool. That's fine. Okay, sorry, guys. Apologies. So you must have been just looking at my desktop for a while. Okay, so as I said, this is the first slide, which is talking about the process, and that's fine. Again, as I was saying, why we need a small sites toolkit. I won't go through that again. Are the slides changing for you all? Fine, perfect. And why small sites? So small sites in Merton, as you all know, come in all shapes and sizes, all different conditions, backland, street facing, and all of them have different constraints and must be looked at differently. Alongside that, they come in varying qualities. So some are of a higher quality and some are of a lower quality. And really, this is maybe an outcome from not having any design guidance in the first place. And so the design guidance is in place to really try and make sure that the minimum bar set is actually good quality design, and that there can be a place where they can go and learn about how they can deliver good design. Within the design guidance itself, we focus on 4 main types of site. One of them is existing buildings. So this primarily looks at conversions. The second one is upward extensions and rooftop extensions, which is looking at moving up onto the roofs. The third is street-facing conditions. So this could be a series of a parade shop, which turns into a larger thing, a corner site, which is street-facing, or mid-terrace infills, or brownfield sites, which are facing streets, and then backland developments, which is looking at maybe rear garden development or potential old industrial sites locked within a perimeter, which can deliver homes. Alongside those 4 types, we've also had some some guidance on undevelopable sites, because I think it's really important that we don't focus purely on homes, but look at social infrastructure and how those sites can actually come forward also. So we've suggested that people can use Space Hive and things like the Neighbourhood Fund, which is from Merton Council, to try and deliver other sites which may not be fit for purpose for homes. But I just thought I'd throw that in there because I think it's important to know that small sites aren't purely for homes, but we acknowledge that they can have social value within neighbourhoods. The toolkit itself is 3 main tools. The first one being design guidance, which is a sequence of questions which ask developers, applicants, certain things so that they're thinking about the right things. So how are your bins stored? Have you thought about the massing and scale and the approach to the architectural articulation, things like that, things which you could typically find in design guidance. The second is case studies. So this really is a catalogue of exemplar projects on small sites so that it's something which people can point at. I think quite often people look at an example down their road and say, I'll have one of those. And that's maybe because they haven't got something to hand which they can say, actually, this is a really great project. Can we deliver something like this? And the third is a design and access statement template. And that's because we get such a variety in terms of quality in the council in terms of design and access statements. This design and access statement just asks the correct questions to try and allow the applicant to visually justify their design moves, which is quite often forgotten about in design and access statements for these types of developments. The design guidance itself revolves around four key principles. The first one being made in Merton, which really works alongside the character study, which you've all heard about already, and really tries to strengthen the direction of Merton's local plan, as well as think strategically about the vision of small sites. Can they unlock extra routes? Can they do things like that? The second one is putting people first. This is talking about the communal spaces, as well as the spaces between buildings, how they can be people focused. The third is fit for purpose. So this is looking at how you can make functional and well-proportioned design so that you're being above minimums and that they're fit for purpose for contemporary living. And the fourth one is economical and sustainable. And that really is how to drive towards net zero carbon 2050 and the design approach you can do for that type of, to try and achieve that. So quickly, I won't go through the whole guidance. I'm just going to show you 2 pages. So the guidance itself is what we consider typical guidance, which is parameters, rules of thumbs, like drag distances of bins to the 45-degree rule for massing to avoid overbearing massing and overshadowing. Alongside that, we've developed a series of non-typical guidance, which looks at things like the lobby space should have a natural light and there should be enough space for people to have a conversation as you enter the building, or you should be able to see the stairs to promote the use of stairs rather than lift. So we've tried to merge both of these types of guidance within this so that things which quite typically are forgotten from small site development is actually thought about. And it's something which we can point to when appraising applications to try and say, well, have you actually thought about this with your design? The case studies, I'll just show you this page, but they're, like as I said, it's exemplar projects of different design principles. So this one in Merton looks at how this end of terrace extension is of character. It tells you the points why it's effective and why it's a successful example of this. And we have a series of different case studies to show. And then the design and access statement, as I said, asks different questions to try and make the applicant really probe why they're making design moves. So they are actually design driven and justified. So even things like as simply as, have you shown where the context is of your proposal? Because we do get applications which are floating, and it's just something to really say, have you drawn the context and considered the context when you're designing a project? So within the 6-week consultation, this is the last slide. The feedback so far has been this. So we've had responses from the public, from industry professionals, Met Police, TfL, Natural England, Historic England. We've had a conversation, funnily enough, from a developer, which is saying, should the guidance be more prescriptive? So maybe more similar to what Croydon has delivered, which is quite technical and quite prescriptive. I.e., how does the guidance show what the council would refuse? So it's creating more certainty. It's a question which we've asked ourselves. We tried to pitch the document originally as something which a smaller developer would be able to use. and that gives a bit of scope for creativity, because we were unsure whether the technical nature of a more prescriptive guidance would stifle creativity, but it's something which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. More emphasis on achieving zero carbon 2050 and how it relates to local plan policies, so strengthening those ties with sustainability. Highlight the value of experts required to make a good design team. I think this has come up quite a few times in terms of with smaller projects, maybe the applicant doesn't see the value on having a QS early on in its design process or things like that. But with a good team, you can have a better outcome. And we're just putting that to the fore to really make sure that future developers really choose a strong design team from the get. And then the last one is there more steer which we can provide for urban small sites? So at the moment, I think there's a feeling that our design guidance is more geared towards suburban types and suburban conditions. Is there something which we can do which really pushes more urban sites? And that's the end of the presentation. Apologies for the beginning.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, clearly the development of small sites is crucial to a London borough such as our own. So we'll follow the same format as before. Questions for clarification of any points of fact, and then comments by individual panel members. So may I start off by asking whether anyone has any questions they would like to put to Mark, please? Yes, Claire, you have a question.
Hi there. Yeah, really enjoyed reading. I just had a quick question about some of your green advice on biodiversity and SUDs, just in particular about maintenance of green space and whether you considered adding a small clause perhaps on how that might be maintained. I know it's typically more of a problem for a large site where there's kind of leftover green spaces that are, you know, more public realm facing, but I think it does also occur in some of the smaller sites too. So just wondered if you had thought about that and kind of put it to one side, or?
No, I don't think we have thought of anything in terms of the management of improving the biodiversity and things like that. It's definitely something which we can think of. As this is design guidance, it is more focused towards a project going towards planning. So we don't really provide any guidance in terms of management or post-occupancy as such, but it is something which we should definitely include. No, thank you for that. That's actually good.
Yeah, sort of just maybe a mention to it. So if they are putting in green spaces, think about how the management might occur, even if it's just kind of a throwaway comment, I suppose, which kind of builds on things like when they're putting in green roofs and things, if they put in not enough soil depth, it will just fail. Yeah, so it's that kind of making sure they think about what's going to happen to that if they do put that in.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Isabella.
Hi, I just was interested in the proposal that you've made for the draft design and access statement, which I think is great because there are some real shockers that I've seen coming out now and then. I wonder, is that finished in terms of what you would be publishing, or is there more to come in terms of the images? Are you going to prescribe scales for drawings, things like that?
Abri, you may want to jump on this question. Yeah, go for it.
So we're already in the process of revising that current iteration of the template. So we have included a list of drawings at the end of the template, like a checklist that will say, provide drawings at a certain scale, provide a site plan at a certain scale, just giving more detail as to exactly what we want, even down to providing furniture layouts. So we are sort of providing more detail in terms of what we expect to see in an application.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, I think we move on to comments now, but would someone like to volunteer to summarize the comments at the end, please? One of the panel members might like to volunteer.
Go on, somebody.
I don't mind doing it.
B, excellent.
B, thank you very much.
Get my pen out.
I'll ask you to speak last to present your own comments as well as the summaries of everybody else's. So let's start with comments then, and perhaps we'll go in the same order as we did before, which I think means that Isabella, would you like to start with your comments, please?
Sure, I will speak really fast. So there's such a lot to discuss because I think it's a great document and really helpful and really great to be pushing these kind of ideas of quality on small sites, which sometimes can get a bit forgotten. So I like the kind of broad spread of the document, you know, from the wider ideas right through to really pragmatic issues like internal storage and refuse stores, things that sometimes are forgotten in terms of quality. So I thought that was great. And the inclusion of the draft design and access statement, I think is a really good idea with a checklist. I think there's a few things. So you kind of mentioned about, you know, should it be more prescriptive? Do you think it would stifle creativity? I don't think so necessarily. I think, you know, if you're creative, you can respond to a lot of requirements. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think it's more about demanding good quality from smaller developers and maybe less experienced developers as well. So I wouldn't see that as a problem in being relatively, maybe not prescriptive, but quite demanding, particularly these small sites. So sometimes I got the sense that some of the guidance maybe felt a bit like it could apply to really tall buildings, but I think, or big developments, but when you're talking about small developments, I think in a way you can be a bit more demanding in some respects. So things like saying you demand natural lighting and natural ventilation to circulation spaces. I think you can say that when you have a small building. I think there's a few other things where I feel like you could suggest pushing the quality further, even being even more demanding in certain things. So when we talk about the sustainability elements of the projects which you brought up, maybe you might be pushing further things to do with looking at embodied carbon as well. You know, we talk about the quality of materials, but we should talk about the embodied carbon of the materials as well. We talk about kind of SAP calculations at planning stage, but maybe we should be demanding overheating analysis as well. We talk about landscaping, and Claire was talking about landscaping and management, but maybe we should be saying, should there be planting plans at planning stage? Should we be demanding the percentage of permeable surfaces, things like this? And internally, I really liked the kind of discussion about all the internal spaces and different types of storage and things like this, and requirement for furniture layouts, which I think is so important. I would even maybe, if you could cull from part M the furniture layouts and put them in, because people, you know, people are sometimes lazy. How like, will they definitely go and look them up? I think, you know, just like they're right there, like look at these, or maybe they're in the draft design and access statement. An example perhaps would be great. So yeah, a few other things like requirement. I mean, I know you can't set demands for internal space standards that are different from the national requirements, but if we can emphasize living, like, or guidance for sizes of living spaces like we used to have in London Housing Design Guide, that would be great. A requirement for spaces for working from home, which I think used to be in, was it Lifetime Homes or was it Code for Sustainable Homes? You used to have to fit a desk in the furniture plans. Can you say, well, we have to have a desk in the furniture plans as well? What else I say? A section on retrofit of existing buildings. I don't know. I'm now not sure if that should be in your document or the previous document, because it's kind of like there's a lot of overlap. What else I say? The consultants required within the design team. Yeah, I certainly agree. I think it'd be great to push those early, and also the site information and surveys they might want early. Things like ecology studies and things that, you know, slip through the net. Bats, you never get your bat survey done at the right time of year. Tell them to do it early. You know, we've all fallen through that crack in various projects. Just some terminology, like somewhere it says rooms should be adequately sized. Maybe we should say they should be generously sized. You know, like, let's be demanding. We say somewhere homes need to be innovative, but I don't know if they're high quality and they're highly performing in terms of sustainability. I don't know if they need to be innovative. They just need to be really good. What else have I said? Overheating analysis. Should we be even allowing single aspect south or west facing homes? maybe. And yeah, aesthetic materials that retain their aesthetic quality. I think we should talk about embodied carbon as well. And I thought it was great that you mentioned the Letty guidance. I even thought maybe like stealing a few of their diagrams even might be great, because they do great diagrams too. So I thought that'd be good. And I thought maybe with the inclusion of the example projects, I thought was great. But I wondered with that it might be great to put in example unit plans as well, to go into a bit more detail in terms of the scale, and just and this is just because I'm teaching first year at the moment, so put a scale bar on it, guys. So that I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Claire, would you like to give your comments, please?
Yeah, thanks. I also thought it was a really lovely document, really well set out, really easy to use, and yeah, the sections are just really clear, which just makes it much nicer to read and look at. We're probably going to get lots of comments on sustainability from all of us today. I think there's a few of us in the room. I suppose there was just something I noticed on one of the links, the explanatory note approaches to sustainable design and construction. I think maybe it links to the 2017 version, and I found the 2020 version. So, but I don't know if that one's the latest. So maybe just double check that link. Again, I thought the links to the Letty guide was great. Passive house standards. I just wondered actually if that maybe would be better off linking to the Passive House Trust rather than the BRE, just because Passive House Trust have a lot more free guidance kind of available for designers to use, and it's a bit more designer friendly in that respect, without feeling like they need to go on a course or something like that. The case studies at the end, I thought they were really helpful and nicely set out. I just wondered whether actually there was a highly sustainable one you could put in. I didn't spot one on it, and so I thought maybe there was just maybe a missing one if you've got room for one more page, or switch one out. Form factor is the one thing that I noticed about small sites. The form factor of building can really affect how energy efficient it is, and a lot of small sites go for kind of quite unusual shapes and forms, which mean that they lose a lot of heat, and they've got a lot of thermal bridging. So I just wonder if there was room for mention of form factor on there and how important it is. I was really pleased to see that you had glazing areas on there. So if we could just maybe touch on form factor, that'd be really good. Otherwise, it was yeah, pleasure to look through and read. The template, if you are updating it, it would be great. At the minute, I didn't quite understand whether the way it was laid out with the big green box and the smaller ones on each side would stay, or if you would kind of put diagrams or things in it. But if it is like that, I wondered whether actually you just did a first page that said this is how you should maybe consider laying out a page, rather than doing all the pages with lots of blank boxes. But it might be that you're developing that, so you've got lots of ideas anyway. I think that's all from me.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Deepa Joshi, would you like to give your comments, please, Deepa?
Hi, thank you. Yes, just like to also say that it's a great document. It's lovely to read. It's very easy to capture all of the different parts, and I think quite a lot of the comments have been picked up. But I think just possibly a little bit more on. I feel as if there might be just a little bit stronger guidance on individuals. Say, you know, an individual wanting to add 2 stories to their their home, or, you know, sort of on these kind of impulse spaces, might just where that's appropriate and where it isn't, perhaps just a little bit more stronger guidance on that. Before I forget, the great example actually that would be great in the precedent studies at the back would probably be Goldsmith Street, just in terms of its achievements on passive house at a low cost. And I think, you know, again, coming back to sort of this simple things like orientation and how those, it's not an unachievable goal to have zero carbon if it's considered from the earliest stage, with, you know, with regard to the LETI guidance, but, you know, looking at orientation and cutting out the sort of mitigation aspects if you actually consider how you lay out your site from the outset. I think also just perhaps just a little bit more on perhaps on community and perhaps what a local character or local area might be able to provide just on a micro level. Maybe a little bit more emphasis on that. It's not quite coming through yet, but I think generally it's a really good document, and I think, you know, would be quite beneficial for someone looking at a small site without a lot of experience.
Thank you very much, Deepa. Michael Whitwell, would you like to give your comments, please? Michael?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes, I'll put my video on. As everyone else has said, I think it's a great little document. It's good because it's quite compact as well. It gives you enough information without droning on. And I love all the little hyperlinks as well. That's really useful if you're, you know, if you're new to this kind of stuff, and then where do I find that? And then actually it's there, which is brilliant. I'd agree with Isabella's point on the prescribed nature of it, whether it should be prescribed or not. I mean, you don't want to stifle people's creativeness by being too prescribed. And going on Deepa's point about loft extensions, you know, what can an individual do? There's lots of information on the planning portal, which you could have a link to on permitted development rights and those kind of things, which would just give, you know, if people were thinking about just doing an extension, well, how far can you go out without actually needing planning permission for it, if you were going to do that sort of development. Like everyone else said, the comments have already really been said, but I think this, in terms of what we see at DRPs a lot of the time, I think if someone went through this document, you know, in our office we have a planning checklist that you have to go through before you actually submit a planning application. You know, this kind of thing where it's saying, have you thought about that? Have you thought about this? Is really, you know, it's a great little thing to have, which people could just quickly look to and see what the borough's kind of view on things is. I would just say on page 10, 11, you haven't put the DRP as part of the consultation process for planning, which I don't know what size of project we get involved with, Paul, whether we would be looking at small projects. I know we have looked at some small projects before.
That's a Freudian omission, or is that what they call it?
There's space, but another circle in. I know it'd ruin your 12 circles.
It's a will Paul pick that one up omission.
Otherwise, yeah, I agree with everyone else. It's a great little document and be really helpful, just like the bigger document as well, to make sure that we don't get people coming to DRPs, particularly with buildings that overlook other buildings or don't have layouts that work, or yeah. Oh, and also, I think it was Isabella's point on the size of the rooms. You could add a link to the nationally prescribed space standards document, which goes into the minimum size of the bedrooms and those kind of things, minimum sizes and widths of bedrooms, lounges, which would just add to that, which has that table in it as well that you've taken. Yeah, so yeah, thank you. It was a really nice document.
Thank you, Michael. Marcus Beale. Marcus, could we have your comments, please?
Hi. Again, I agree with colleagues. I think it's a very useful document, and it's an invitation to applicants to raise their game to a certain kind of minimum level, at which point it actually becomes possible really to evaluate their design. I like the links. I would like there to be a little bibliography page at the back where all those links are sort of spelt out, because it is in the nature of hyperlinks that they cease to work after a year or two. So if you know that that was pointing to, you know, LETI or the MPPF or something, you'd then be able to find the latest guidance rather than building in any obsolescence into our document. I have a question about whether this can be any more prescriptive than the London Plan. I suspect it can't in terms of the kind of hierarchy of policies. So in terms of, can we insist on single aspect? I mean, what we've written at the moment on single aspect is a bit self-contradictory. Let me just find it. Bear with me a moment, sorry. We say that we don't like north-facing single, says we don't like single aspect homes that contain 3 or more bedrooms at 6.1.14. And then we say at 6.1.16, new homes should have dual aspect unless there are circumstances that justify the inclusion of single aspect. Well, what are the circumstances? I mean, they're hinted at in the London Plan. We say we don't like north-facing single aspect homes, but actually a west-facing single aspect home is much less comfortable than a north-facing single aspect home because of overheating. And probably for that reason, we shouldn't have south-facing single aspect homes. So really, we should only have southeast-facing single aspect homes, possibly. I don't know. We need to just be careful what our policy is on that, because as a practitioner, I've seen schemes start at 100% dual aspect and end up at 60% dual aspect. And how many 100% dual aspect schemes have we seen come before us as a DRP? Vanishingly few. And of those, vanishingly few of them actually get built. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about that. Same with ceiling heights. We say on the one hand, we want ceiling heights of 2.5 meters. And then we say anything less than 1.5 meters is not usable space. So we just need to make sure that actually adds up. And what do you do with rooms that are between 1.5 and 2.5 meter ceiling heights? I think the London Plan refers to a proportion of the floor area being 2.5 or more. I think from memory, it might be 70%. Again, perhaps we should refer to the London Plan if that takes precedence over our local policies anyway. Otherwise, I think it's good. It will be really interesting to see what effect it has. At least we'll be able to refer people, applicants, to something and say, look, we expect you to come up with something like this. In terms of the design and access statement template, the bit that I immediately zoomed in was heritage. It's kind of okay, but it skips a little bit on page 23. It says, how will the proposal affect the asset? Refer to relevant national local policies. I would also refer people to Historic England, who produce fantastic guidance. And if the impact is negative, set out the public benefits that justify the proposal. Well, that's not exactly how the MPPF phrases that. So it just needs a little bit of careful editing that. You need to assess whether the impacts are substantial or less than substantial. And only if they're less than substantial should you weigh them against the public benefits. But that's a quibble, really. I think it's a great document, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Gazine Juncker, could we have your comments, please, Gazine?
Hi, yeah. I'll just focus on a couple of areas. One is around the where you treat open space or public open space. So the reference, for example, to the neighborhood fund is that's sort of one of these things, different funding streams, they often get out of date. And I was also wondering, yes, it's great that you are sort of capturing a bit on if a site is not developable, what else can you do? But if I would have an area which I sort of see in the street and I think, oh, that would be great to do something there, would this be the document I would go for guidance? And whether actually the borough should look at something maybe which is a different document, which can treat those sites specifically, and not trying to sort of lump this into what is effectively very much a residential development-led piece of guidance. And there are other documents which are really helpful in that respect. So I feel a slightly half-baked approach. That also relates to the examples on sustainable urban drainage, and some references was made to street tree planting. Being mindful that, for example, all the SUDS examples were spaces probably not in control of the applicant. And there's then immediately questions coming up around ownership, maintenance and adoption. So, and I think the reason why you only have shown public realm images for SUDS is if you have a small site, it's just incredibly difficult to then also include some SUDS. In that respect, I would recommend to focus on what's within the control of the applicant and not to veer any further. Two other elements at the beginning, site constraints, light, sunlight, and right of light should be mentioned because it's a particular area around neighborhood concerns. And in the glossary, right of light should get referenced. And there's a tricky one in the glossary around active travel. So TfL considers active travel also use of public transport, so using buses and rail and tube, and not just what you would think is active, i.e. walking and cycling. So there's a bit of a twist in terminology you want to consider if you want to use the TfL standard for that, or yeah, sort of more to the true meaning of the word, what is active travel. These are my comments, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazim. Be Young, perhaps you could give us your comments and a summary of the comments of colleagues. B.
So thanks so much for the presentation. I absolutely love the document. I think it's exactly what Merton needs, and I think it will be, amazing, especially I think as Marcus alluded to. Hopefully we'll see a massive change in how schemes are brought forward to DRP, where we do get the brilliant ones, but we also do get the ones that sometimes struggle to represent themselves and good design properly. So I think it's a really, really great document. I thought it was really well presented, and I thought the balance in terms of illustration and text was really easily readable and something that someone could pick up and quite easily navigate around. So I thought the document structure, the length, and just the accessibility of information was brilliant. So yeah, the only thing I wondered was, and I think someone's mentioned, is it is very residential focused, and I didn't know whether within your examples that you could diversify and potentially look at something more like a senior living or a fully accessible home, or there's a lot of homes that are now being built, as we all know, purely for rent, and whether some of the smaller houses, you know, a lot of developers would come along and maybe develop something that could be, you know, 6 or 7 flats that they could rent, and whether there was something just to pick up those and the differences that they'd need in terms of how they're designed versus a standard residential. And the only other thing I thought that potentially you could pick up, I saw that you had Mapleton Crescent on there, which is obviously completely modular. So in terms of where we're going with circular economy and everything else, obviously MMC is a big target for people to help reduce their waste. And I wondered whether there was something there, whether you could bring in more of sort of like the, you know, MMC, and how that could be potentially brought into design. And that could be as simple as sort of the laminated timber and other elements that could be developed on these small sites where they're completely compliant with fire and everything else, where obviously there's potentially more challenges with laminated timber on bigger buildings. So they were my main comments on the document. I think everything else got picked up. Let me just check. Oh, the only other thing I wondered was, I know you've got it on one page, you talk about the articulation between public and private space. On a lot of the examples you've shown where you've drawn the plans, you don't actually show the site boundary in terms of how it relates to the pavement and actually how that's treated. I know you pick it up, but whether maybe on the examples you show, that's something that could also be brought in, because I think some of them are more successful than others. I know some are sort of like car parking bays, and you know, if you are going to put a car parking bay, how do you design that pavement and just those things? Although obviously cars are becoming hopefully less and less required. I think there were a lot of positives. I've got quite a few notes here, so just summarizing up from the panel. It's a great document. It's really well set out. It's easy to see. They like the ideas. It's a great example in terms of hopefully how we'll see good design come forward. It's good, it's compact, the hyperlinks are really positive, but potentially there could be links at the end, which I think Marcus suggested, which is a great idea, just to make sure that the information doesn't become out of date. And that further links, I think hopefully you've all written them down, were suggested by other panel members such as Betty, Passive House Guidance, etc. I think there was then a question amongst the panel about whether it needs to be more demanding or whether it's actually suitable as it is, in terms of it's giving enough freedom there for people to come forward. So I think I'll leave that question out because it seemed to balance out between the panel as to thoughts. I don't really think there were any negatives. I think there were some sort of comments just to help make it even better, just to build upon. So I think the key ones that potentially could be developed further were sustainability, and I think particularly that was overheating, embodied carbon, SUDs, and then I think one of the other big ones that we talked quite a lot about was single aspect units, and then in making sure that everything we do links back to the London plan. There was an idea about just reinforcing the links to minimum sizes, or whether we could suggest that they could be more generous, such as the use of a desk. I remember having to draw desks in units, so that definitely used to be there, to make sure that there is a work from home space, and whether we could link that to the standards again. I think there was a question about whether houses need to be innovative, or whether actually there was enough information in there to allow them actually to be highly contextual, and that in its own right would bring on the innovation. And that the idea would be that it would be good to get another example that put a highly sustainable solution, and the suggestion was for it to be Goldsmith Street, that would show how you can do that with low cost. I think the DAS is obviously under development, so there are a few comments potentially on how that could be developed further. And I think that hopefully sums up most of them. I do have one last comment that I didn't mention, is I really like the fact that you brought into the document, in fact it was the first note I'd written down, the spaces that can't be developed. And I actually think that Gesina's idea of a separate document that Merton could bring forward to really show how those spaces could be used, that could sit between the two documents we've reviewed today, to really show how we can bring innovation to the spaces that currently can't be built on, would be a real asset to Merton as a borough to live in. So if I've missed any comments, do add in or shout if there's anything I've not picked up from the panel. But otherwise, that's it from me.
Thank you for your comments, Bea, and also thank you for summarising the comments of colleagues. I'd just like to thank Mark and Abby for all their hard work on the toolkit. Clearly a lot of work has gone into it, so thank you for that. I'd also, of course, like to thank panel members for their comments and thoughts today. Before we close, perhaps I should ask Paul McGarry and Paul Garrett, is there anything they would like to say at this stage?
I don't have anything to say at the moment. Paul, do you?
No, I'll just say thank you to the team for the presentations today and the panel participants for taking part. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and Paul.
Okay.
I think that brings the meeting to a close. but we may stay on the line for any debrief that we want to.
Yeah, we'll just do that just in case anybody else wants to add anything about how the meeting went or anything like that. But to all intents and purposes, the review is over. And Paul, I think you can probably stop the recording.
Thank you.